Episode 6, 2005. The struggle of today is not altogether for today. It is for a vast future also.
Now, on Inside the Buffalo...
Wait! Can't use that title. How about this? All right.
Welcome to another episode of Down and Drought, the weekly walk down memory lane with each of the 17 years that the Buffalo Bills have missed the postseason. I'm Prescott Rossi. Alongside me, Thad Brown. We have a new guest sitting in Dave Yates' seat. It is Mark Gruba, who was a sports anchor at the time at another station in town. So we have a lot to talk about. Mark, we're going to jump in with 2005. And right off the top, the Bills are coming off a 9-7 season in 2004. Everybody knows about the Week 17 game against Pittsburgh. But your initial memories to going into that offseason after the 04 season?
Well, I think there was a lot of excitement coming off that 04 season. Again, you take that last game of the season away against Pittsburgh, and this was a team that was right on the cusp of the playoffs. It had only been a few years that they had been out of the playoffs.
Only 5.
Right, and I think people thought, okay, we have the pieces in place. I think the big issue there was the quarterback play. You could tell during that 04 season that Bledsoe was on the decline. He had become more statuesque in the pocket. He was taking some bad sacks. And I think the question was, do they have enough pieces around him to make that playoff push?
And then just into the start of that offseason, on February 16th, the Bills announced that they're going to cut Drew Bledsoe, but when cuts become available on February 22nd. And so the thought that, okay, Bledsoe's gone, Lossman is the guy. Your thoughts, fellas? Because Lossman didn't have much of an 04 season at all. He barely played. All right, they're turning the keys over to him.
Look, I think the thing that made that decision controversial was that no one really bought into J.P. Lossman. We talked about that last week in the 2004 version of this podcast, that when he was picked, no one bought into it as a good idea. And now him taking the keys to the car and taking over for Drew Bledsoe, yeah, there were obvious flaws with Bledsoe, and not just the declining play, but the escalating salary. And the Bills, in the early part of those 2000s were always up against the salary cap, so there were good reasons to get rid of Bledsoe. The thing was, the option from where the Bills were going to go did not get anybody excited about the upcoming season.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the thing about Lossman is sort of the classic John Madden line that he used about Rob Johnson. He had the hardware, but not the software.
Yes.
You look at that guy, he could throw the ball a country mile. He was a tremendous athlete, but you just felt like he wasn't putting it all together upstairs. And you're turning over the offense, a Mike Mularkey offense, to this guy that had a lot of moving parts and pieces to it, and you just wondered whether or not he was going to be capable of doing that.
In 3 seasons with the Buffalo Bills, Drew Bledsoe goes 23-25, 10,000 yards, 55 touchdowns. But you mentioned the statuesque aspect. Drew Bledsoe was sacked 140 times in 3 seasons. No quarterback is going to be able to maintain that kind of punishment. Also at the start of free agency, the Bills addressed the backup quarterback role with Kelly Holcomb, who had been in a shootout with the Browns in the playoffs against the Steelers. Your thoughts, fellas, on Kelly Holcomb being the guy to kind of be the mentor, the tutor for J.P. Lossman?
I mean, the idea at first was Shane Matthews. That was the guy that the Bills were going to get, or that people thought they were going to get. He was just a guy. I don't think he really swayed it either way. He had his moment with the Browns, and it might have been really just a moment, but as good as anybody else you're going to find at that point.
Yeah, I think the idea with Holcomb was a game manager and somebody that could mentor a young J.P. Lossman. I think that was the basic idea there.
March 14th, this is something I noticed that I picked up in my research. I don't know that it really got a whole lot of play, and this is kind of switching gears for a moment. 2 Erie County legislators asked the Bills to forego a $3.56 million payment to maintain the stadium. And why this is big is if the county is unable to make this payment, they would violate the terms of the lease, which would then result in the Bills having the ability to leave town. And now Ralph Wilson is into his mid-80s. He still lives for another 9 years at this point. But was there that cloud hanging over this franchise at this time that relocation and leaving Western New York was now really on the table with this team?
I think the cloud was there for a good 2 decades. I think it goes back into the 90s. That's why in 98, the team, trotted out Doug Flutie and really aggressively went out and reached out to local stations about, marketing club seats, and that was going to be the new revenue stream. And it wasn't long after this that the Toronto game started happening. It was always there in the back of your mind, especially, as old as Ralph Wilson was. At that point, you knew, there were many less days in front than behind. And whenever Ralph Wilson passed, that was going to become a front burner issue right away.
Yeah, I think for me, as I look back on that time, I think it's when we began to realize that Ralph Wilson was slipping, for lack of a better term, that when he was in public and and speaking about the team that he just didn't have the command that he once did. And that made you start thinking, boy, if he's not all there, what does that mean about the future of this franchise?
4 days after that letter is written, the Bills accept the county's offer, which would defer that payment, which would maintain the lease. So the Bills are staying in Western New York for the time being. And I think, for me, how I look at Ralph Wilson, and I came here at the end of 2011, so I didn't have the interactions with Ralph that you guys did, all throughout this time period. But I think of why the Bills haven't made the postseason for so many years, and I think there probably isn't anyone more responsible for the playoff drought than Ralph Wilson. I think the way he handled John Butler and Wade Phillips, and then the hires he made after that, kind of set the table for the Bills not being particularly good at football. Yet, at the same time, he would do things like this, like deferring payments from the county and maintaining and buying empty seats to prevent blackouts. What were your thoughts on Ralph Wilson at this time? And you mentioned, as he's getting into his 80s, that he's slipping, and obviously, he's an old man, and to know that the end will be coming probably sooner rather than later.
I mean, for me, I think what you have to remember about Ralph is this is a man that was enormously successful in his life.
Yes.
And he used his own intelligence to create a lot of that wealth. And I think he relied upon his abilities to keep things, the way he wanted them, set up the way he wanted. So I always felt like he just didn't have that person that he could turn to and say, here's what I'm thinking, what do you think? That he really just kind of kept it to himself and tried to make those decisions. And I think as he got older, I think it became more difficult for him to really manage all the aspects of those decisions.
I think the parting with Bill Polian and then John Butler, it really left him without a peer in the organization. At that point, Russ Brandon, became probably the closest thing he had, but he looked at Russ Brandon like a son. It's not quite the same relationship that you would have needed to have a sounding board there, like you say. And I think the other part of it too is don't overlook the idea that buying up seats is a PR move. We don't want to have a blackout.
Agreed.
There were small things that he could do to maybe assuage the negative publicity, whereas actually going out and spending money on a head coach or a scouting department, or the things that we always thought he kind of cheaped out on during this period were different sort of commitments. I think it was no problem for him to make the smaller, let's put out a fire right now, as opposed to addressing the larger, look, you need to put real money into this team, this front office, to be able to compete with the Dallases and the New Yorks that were going this way with their revenue that Buffalo couldn't compete with.
New England, too.
Exactly.
At this point, they're coming off back-to-back Super Bowls.
Right.
We talked about scouting departments in the front office. Well, the NFL draft, April 22nd and 23rd. The Bills don't have a first-round pick because it's now a part of the Dallas Cowboys because of the J.P. Lossman trade from a year ago. So that pick is number 20. And I was kind of kicking around this idea in my mind of that Lossman plays no impact in the Bills' results in 2004. So you think that, you just almost forget that the Bills even made that trade. So you think that the Bills would probably, without Lossman, have resulted in a 9-7 record and the 20th overall pick. If they were to look at the quarterback position at that time with the 20th overall pick, well, guess who's available in the NFL draft at that time? Aaron Rodgers. Of course, there are a million things that could change how, the butterfly effect and all that. But the thought that, man, if they don't make the Lossman trade, Aaron Rodgers is possibly there for them. That's when you just go, oh, man. And I think about the Lossman trade, like the worst decisions made during the playoff drought, it has to be in the top 5, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, at the time and in hindsight, it looks awful.
Certainly in terms of draft day choices. It's probably, Aaron Mabin, John McCargo, Mike Williams, Lossman in some order.
Yeah.
Those are probably the 4.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt. And I think, it's not really talked about, that the Bills would have had a shot at Aaron Rodgers because the pick is made and Aaron Rodgers doesn't really become a star for 3-4 years later. You don't think about how.
And that plays into perhaps why Aaron Rodgers is an all-pro quarterback now.
You talk about butterfly effect. If he goes to Buffalo, he plays right away. He's not playing in Green Bay's system, blah, 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 blah. Regardless, I think there's a pretty good chance Aaron Rodgers would have been a Buffalo Bill if they don't trade for J.P. Lossman.
Yeah, I mean, either way you look at it, not having that first-round pick that year was, the start of what turned out to be a disastrous draft for this franchise.
Yeah, and a disastrous year,
I know
too.
you've got the numbers in front of you, the rounds and the players and all that, but they essentially got nothing out of that draft.
They really didn't.
And the part about that I always remember about this draft is that even though they didn't have a first-round pick, they still had all the media up there during round 1. And I think it was still Saturday. Saturday, Sunday. So, when they do have a first-round pick, after the pick is made, the GM and head coach come out and talk about the pick. There's questions and actually blah, blah, blah. Well, they didn't have a pick. So when the spot where the Bills were supposed to pick went by, they bring J.P. Lossman out and have a press conference like they had just drafted him. Like, oh, look, here's our first round. They really referred to him as this is our first round pick for this year. Yeah. And because, again, going back to the year before, no one bought into him as an answer, even though he was going to be the starter. No one really believed in him as a quarterback. To bring him out and trumpet him, even J.P., that they had a look in his face like, I don't really like this idea. I don't know why I'm out here.
Yeah.
And it was treated and looked at like an utter joke from the moment the Bills thought of it.
You know, we work in television. You sometimes have a live shot or an interview where you kind of go like, oh, this isn't going well. I can just imagine just being in that meeting room like, oh, cut, please, let's get out of here.
Right.
Well, and Thad, you mentioned the scouting department. The Bills' first pick of that 05 draft comes 8 hours after the draft begins. I can only imagine sitting in that meeting room for 8 hours waiting around for a Bills pick. Well, in the second round at pick 55, the Bills draft Roscoe Parrish, wide receiver out of Miami. And this pick makes no sense to me.
Yep.
If the thought is that maybe he's the replacement for Moulds, but so many other factors make this a terrible pick. First off, you have Lee Evans, who you drafted in the first round the year before. If Parrish is supposed to be a factor in special teams, Terrence McGee went to the Pro Bowl. Like, you don't need to upgrade these positions. Yeah. Why was I can't defend the Roscoe Parrish pick.
And I wonder, this was the start of the Bills going after a long line of small, finger quotes, fast receivers. I mean, it was, T.J. Graham after that and Marquise Goodwin. It just, you looked at it as whether he fits or not on the team, I don't see how he's going to function in the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. If you're talking about putting him into that spot where Moulds was, they're two completely different athletes.
Exactly.
I mean, you just could not, it's apples and oranges there. You know what they saw. Roscoe was an incredible athlete. He really was. I mean, you think about at his size, to excel at that level is amazing. And you could see where you go to the combine and he probably put, mind-blowing numbers up.
3.940 or something.
Yeah,
right.
And you start, and again, I think about Malarkey, and he loved those gadgets on that offense, and you could see him thinking about how he might be able to work this guy in and find places to put him and just kind of have him pop out of nowhere. Next thing you know, he's gone. And he did some of those things with the Bills. But in terms of addressing a need at that moment in time, it was just one of those head-scratching picks. And to your point, a pick that didn't help them right in the moment.
Yeah.
Just like, a year or so earlier when they took McGahee, knowing he was a year away, and Donahoe always seemed to try to make that splash on draft day. And maybe this was his way of trying to do something splashy without having that first-round pick.
June 4th, long after the draft, the Bills unveil new uniforms, the third jersey, the throwback to the 1960s. Your thoughts, fellas, just on those new throwback unis?
People love them. People were so excited for those.
The standing buffalo is back.
I've never been a huge throwback fan for almost any team, just in general, but you could see the navy blue had been a divergence from tradition. This was not only a return to tradition, but it was a return to harken back to the glory days. People couldn't get enough.
No, I would agree. And that helmet, I think people really centered in on that helmet with the standing buffalo and just that idea that, it conjured up memories of a better time. And this was not a good time. And to me, this was part of one of the hallmarks of this period for the Bills is because they were in such a bad way, this drought that we're talking about, every year, every offseason, they seemed to try to come up with something that would galvanize the fan base. You remember they had that massive press conference, and party for Drew Bledsoe's arrival. And, here you've got, it was uniforms. They were trying to get people to rally around these throwback uniforms and, conjuring up those nostalgic memories of yesteryear. I will say this, I agree. I thought, having said that, they were cool, and people bought them.
Yeah.
And they still wear that.
The Bills were good at it. I mean, they were trying to build hope and build excitement. They were good at it.
Nobody sells hope like the Buffalo Bills. July 18th, right before the start of training camp, and this was an underlying story throughout the offseason in 2005. The Bills trade Travis Henry to the Tennessee Titans, and obviously played well in 2002 and 2003. 04 missed a bunch of time due to injury, but your thoughts, fellas, on this was kind of a guy that kind of gets overshadowed because McGahee is taken right as Travis Henry seems to be hitting his stride.
Henry was a good player, not great, but good to very good. I think this was a situation where Tom Donahoe had invested a first-round pick in Willis McGahee, controversially, as Mark pointed out, making a splash with that first round. If you're going to pick one of the two, and you really had to at that point, there just was no reason to keep both these guys on the roster. He's going to keep McGahee and try and trade Travis Henry. And we went round and round all offseason trying to figure it out. Eventually, it did get done to the benefit of the Bills. Henry ended up in Tennessee, which I don't know if was a great spot for him. No. But at the end of the day, he needed to be out of Buffalo, and Buffalo needed to go just with McGahee was, too, the better back. I mean, if you're going to look at just sheer talent, they picked the right guy to keep. You know, the injuries were concerned, blah, blah, blah. But McGahee had shown that he was going to be more likely to be a star than Travis.
I would agree with that, and that was the point I was going to make. I think at that point, they had enough on McGahee to know that he was going to play at a high level in the NFL. Was he ever going to be that, superstar back he was at Miami? I think the jury was out there, but they knew they had enough, and I know they were comfortable trading Henry at that point.
Henry goes to Tennessee for a third-round pick. The teams he was rumored with in the offseason, and there are a bunch, Jags, Eagles, Cardinals, Dolphins, Seahawks, all at different points were thinking like, oh, they're going to trade for Travis Henry. The stuff that I found in my research was that Tom Donahoe was asking for too much, and the teams weren't willing to pull the trigger on a guy like Travis Henry, who goes to Tennessee to not even start. He's backing up Chris Brown there. A lot has been made about Travis Henry's off-the-field activities and some of the things he's done in his life. But, fellas, your interactions with Travis Henry, what was he like?
Decent guy. Not the sharpest tool in the shed, but a decent guy. Good to deal with, pretty much stand up, never shied away from the media. The joke with us was always he would say the word execute with an R in it, so it'd be execute. Yeah. We'd all kind of laugh about it. And it was, we all have things that we say and don't say correctly, and that was just his. And he used it a lot, but a good guy to deal with, respect for him for sure. I never remember him backing away from anything.
No, and he put the ball on the ground in a couple places where he shouldn't have, and he always stood up and took the heat, took the fire, so to speak. But look, to me, he was just a football player. He was born to play football, and he excelled at it. He was out of a place in Buffalo. They had to get rid of him.
Training camp starts right at the end of July of 2005. The two stories that really emerged from this camp, Roscoe Parrish, their second-round pick, has wrist surgery and misses the first 10 games of the season anyway. So you're really getting nothing out of the first 2 rounds. Yeah. But also J.P. Lossman. It's clear he's the starting quarterback. The Bills have been saying this all throughout the offseason. There was no quarterback controversy during training camp, but Lossman at times looks frustrated. He's throwing towels, spiking helmets. He's visibly upset on the sideline. Were there rumblings at this point that I don't know that JP has a full grasp of this Bills offense?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the thing with Lossman was, and if you play sports, you know this, that to me, he was always thinking. It really never became instinctive for him. Where you learn something to the point where it becomes second nature. And then you don't think about doing it, you just do it. And I just don't think he ever got beyond that point. He showed flashes of it. In fact, we'll talk about it here. There were flashes, but I just don't think he ever got beyond that point. And I think in this situation where the spotlight was on him entirely, it was his team, I just think he was inside his head the whole time.
One thing you got to think about from a TV point of view in training camp is that we're out there recording practice. You have a camera on our shoulders shooting practice. And, practice is practice. It's repetition. It's routine. So you over and over, out pattern, out pattern, out pattern. These things that just get mind-numbingly boring. What you're looking for as a photographer in these practices is something unique, a great catch, like a one-handed grab or something over your head. Mm-hmm. Well, for that to happen, you need a bad pass. So prior to those few years, basically you get when the fourth quarterback that you knew wasn't making the team, or the backup or the third stringer stepped up, all right, I got to be ready because this is where my highlight's going to come because this guy's not as good as the starter. That camp, I remember thinking, I am more up for J.P. Lossman's reps than Kelly Holcomb or anybody else's among the quarterbacks because that's where I'm going to get my bad throw and that's where I'm going to get my highlight. And that was the moment where I thought, this is probably not going to work out.
Oh, my goodness. So the Bills go into week 1 of the 2005 season at home against the Houston Texans. The sun is shining at Ralph Wilson Stadium. Not only on the fans, but also for the Buffalo Bills, as everything seemingly goes well in a 22-7 win over the Texans. Fellas, your thoughts from that game as Lossman rides out the victor in week 1?
Well, I will say this. At varying points throughout the drought, the Bills have had moments like that. Where they come out of the gate week 1, and people are ready to print up Super Bowl tickets. We've seen it happen. Even recently, we've seen it happen. And that day was one of those days. It was not a great win.
No.
But it went the way the Bills wanted to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, people were like, okay, you know, we got the win.
There was enough to sell out of that game.
Right. It was not a well-played game. You know, in the end, my buddy Jason Peters ended up catching a touchdown pass in that game. I think on like a tackle eligible.
Absolutely.
And you know, that was sort of the highlight. You know, and you think to yourself, okay, that's great, but what about Lee Evans or Eric Moulds?
Or the fact they kicked 5 field goals. Remember, they came out of that game. We're all wondering, red zone offense, anybody? You know, and
right.
It was 22-7. It was fun because the tackle caught. Look at how creative the Bills are. Little tricky Bills.
Big guy touchdown.
Yeah, exactly. But you walk away from that game thinking, good, but you can't score 5 field goals in the red zone against other teams. And then, you know, the Texans were still, what, a 3-year-old franchise? They were still the whooping boy of the league. So you beat Houston by 2 touchdowns at home. It's kind of what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Week 2, the Bills go on the road to Tampa Bay. Doesn't go very well, does it? J.P. Lossman runs out of the back of the end zone for a safety. People laugh about other players doing this later down the road, but Lossman has a bad game in this one. Sacked twice, 11 for 28 passing. The Tampa Bay is kind of a house of horrors for this Bills team. We remember back in 2000 when Rob Johnson was planted below the turf by Derek Brooks, but the Bucs win 19-3. Bills dropped to 1-1.
That J.P. Lossman, when he stepped out of the end zone, that was one of the, as good as the week 1 had been, that was one of the signs where, you know, come on, you got to know where you are in the field. That was something that was talked about, you know, in the days following, that we have a quarterback that can't figure out where the big white line is that he can't step on.
Week 3, the Bills host the Atlanta Falcons. Significant because Takeo Spikes, after an all-pro season in 2004, tears his Achilles. And obviously the voice of that defense, along with London Fletcher, just the immediate win coming out of the sails for Takeo Spikes, and right at the start of the season having an offensive leader go down.
Cannot overstate how big that was for this team. I mean, that guy was the guy. He was signed to be the guy for the Bills, and he largely was the guy for the Bills. And when he left that defense, it changed what they could do. I mean, you had Lawyer Malloy in the secondary as well. There's another veteran, you know, that was getting toward the end, but at least knew how to play. Spikes was one of the few guys they had that could change a game by himself. And when you took him off the field, that took out, you know, for that defense especially, it took out a piece that they could not replace.
And it wasn't just on the field. He could change a game. He could do it in the locker room, too.
Yeah.
And losing him there was almost as big. I remember crowd goes silent. Everybody knew. Everybody knew what had happened.
Yep.
And, you know, as much as J.P. Lossman was a key to that season, when he went down, when Spikes went down, you just had a feeling that things were going to start to circle the drain really quick.
1-2 after 3 weeks. Week 4, the Bills go on the road. Should have been to New Orleans, but Hurricane Katrina happens right before the start of the season. So the Saints have their first home game, a pseudo home game, in San Antonio at the Alamo Dome. You know, we've talked about other major events and how you cover a football team while this major thing is going on that's in the back of your mind. And, you know, obviously your thoughts are with New Orleans at this time. So to go to San Antonio for a football game when you know that, you know, where this team is located, all these atrocities are happening. Did you cover a game like that in the lead up, and then of course the game in San Antonio itself?
Well, and I was there. I went to that game in San Antonio, and nothing felt right about that from the get-go. I can tell you that. There was a lot of anticipation about going to New Orleans. It's a fun place in the NFL to go and cover a game.
Can confirm.
I had that one circled on the calendar, and I have to get a little bit personal here for me because that was around the time my first child was born. And going to San Antonio was the first time that I left my wife with this newborn baby. It was 2 weeks after she was born, and so I was not the most popular person in my household at that point. But we took the trip, and I just remember that environment in San Antonio. Those fans were so hungry for that game. They wanted to put on a good show, but it just didn't have the feel of an NFL game. And that game was largely forgettable as well. You know, there wasn't much about what took place on the field that was memorable. They went right down the field at the beginning of the game. The Bills did. McGahee punched in a short one. They took the early lead, and that was basically it. Lossman had a horrible game that day. And as I recall, Holcomb ended up coming in for him in that game. And that
benched
was
in the fourth quarter.
Right, and they just couldn't do anything. I think he threw for under 100 yards that day, I think, and they could not move the ball.
Lossman goes 7 of 15 for 75 yards.
Okay,
there you go. That's not very good, folks. This game does have one memorable moment, and I think it may be the play of the Bills' 17-year playoff drought. Right at the end of the first half, Terrence McGee fields a kickoff just inside his own red zone, cuts back, makes a few moves, fakes a few guys out, thinks he has daylight to the end zone for a touchdown right at the end of the half. It's 6 points or no points because the clock is at 0, and he gets tripped up by Mark Campbell and a Saints player on special teams. I can't, just, you think about the drought and you go, yeah, that's it.
That's it, yeah.
That's it right there.
It might be the greatest and the most perfect drought play in the entirety of the 17-year period the Bills have not made the playoffs. And, I did not go to that game, but I remember watching that play on TV, and you're like, no, he's down. No, he's not. He's down. He's down. No, he's still going? No? I mean, are you kidding? And then you get to the end, and you watch it over and over. There's like 6 white jerseys and 1 Saints player lying on his chest at the 10-yard line, and that's the guy who makes the tackle. Somehow, it was a totally Bills play. And then on top of that, so everybody's kind of jazzed up about that last play. The Bills thought they were in. The Saints make the play. It's a great play.
Yep.
No matter how you slice it, what the result are, it's a fantastic play for the Bills. So it's not really an NFL stadium. So both teams are walking up the same tunnel. So they get into the tunnel, and some words start to get exchanged. Sam Adams is sticking up for one of the Bills. All of a sudden, there's a scuffle in the tunnel. And it wasn't anything big. No punches were thrown. But, for a league at that point, 2005, where there were quite a few stadiums that teams shared the tunnel going back to the locker room, you were surprised that something like that didn't happen more often. It was unique, even though there wasn't, again, nothing serious, but it was unique enough that it was a big part of the story in that game. Not story A or B, but you still talked about, hey, they got into a fight at halftime, after that long run by McGee.
Box score says it was an 82-yard return, but it was really more like a 182-yard return.
Really, yeah, but, one of those NFL follies moments.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
For sure.
I mean, that's
oh, he's going to the end zone. Oh, he's tripped up by his own player.
Yeah.
Saints win 19-7. The Bills drop to 1-3. So, yeah, not a good first 4 games for the Buffalo Bills. Week 5.
It's Dolphin Week.
They host the Miami Dolphins. Lossman benched again, this time for Holcomb. And it's starting to seem like Holcomb is now going to be the guy because Lossman, whether it's in his head or what, it's not working for him at this point. The thought that, okay, we're 4 weeks in, now in week 5, and the keys are seemingly going to the backup of 32-year-old Kelly Holcomb. I
think the one thing you take out of that is the Bills had committed to Lossman in the offseason. They had dumped Drew Bledsoe for this guy, and now a month into the season, they're already done with JP Lossman. All the warning chimes were there for this is going to be a disaster, and the season turned out to be a failure.
Bills picked off Gus Frerotte 3 times in that Week 5 win against the Dolphins. Week 6, they host the Jets. Testaverde sacked 5 times. He's 42 years old. Fellas, that has to hurt, being 42, sacked 5 times by an NFL defense. Bills win 27-17, so they're 3-3. Mm-hmm. Holcomb is the guy now, it seems like, and the Bills are slowly turning around their season, but still with 10 games left to go. I can't imagine there were thoughts that this team was going to replicate what they had done the season prior.
I don't think
rattling off 6 straight wins and going.
I don't think anybody was buying it. I think the backup was in. He had a couple of good games. But this was, at this point, I think some of the Bills' despair, the Bills' expectation that things are not going to go wrong had started to settle in. And I don't think people were buying that Kelly Holcomb was going to be the savior for that season.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the hallmarks of this drought has been that Charlie Brown effect. When is the other shoe going to drop? When is the football going to get pulled away at the last second? Right, I think this was just part and parcel with that. And it started, with the Spikes injury, and then when you see things are not playing out at quarterback the way you want it to, right, now you're starting to think, okay, where could we fall in the draft?
Week 7, the Bills go to the Oakland Raiders. In the lead-up to that game, Willis McGahee on a conference call says, I am the best back in the NFL. Case closed. I'm not worried what they're going to do. They better worry about what I'm going to do. Well, McGahee carries the ball 16 times for 50 yards and no touchdowns. Meanwhile, Lamont Jordan has 122 yards and 3 touchdowns as the Raiders win 38-17. And, you talk about fool's gold with the Buffalo Bills being 3-3. Well, now they're 3-4, and we know this is not going to be like the 04 or any year prior.
But this is one of those moments in a season where, as a fan, from a fan's perspective, you're still doing the calculations. They're 4-3, we're 3-4, we still have a head-to-head matchup. You're still trying to figure out how you can make it work. And then like I said, there's that part of that fan base that's already looking ahead to the draft. They've seen enough, and they've been down this road before, and they know this is just the latest version of it.
Total Bills moment again too, because they had something to play for. There was hope there, like you said, reasonable hope. They're one of their only really remaining star on offense talks a little trash. and then they get their comeuppance. Not only does the star not play well, but some random guy on the other team runs for 150 yards, whatever it was, and 3 touchdowns. And how many, the litany of running backs that have come out of nowhere, really starting with Willie Parker the year before, and continuing on until, everybody that's happened in the last few years. Lamont Jordan was just another example of that.
Yeah, and that was not a great Raider team either. For the record.
No.
Let's be clear about that.
The Super Bowl was 02 that they went to, but it's 3 years later, and everything's different. Week 8, the Bills go to New England for a Sunday night football game. Teddy Bruschi had suffered a stroke in the offseason. This is his first game back. We know Bills in New England is already going to be a disaster, but now you have a primetime game where a defensive leader is making this miraculous return after an incredible, horrendous offseason injury. Bills were up in this game, but did you ever think they were actually going to pull off a win in Foxborough?
A little bit of it. You're like, really? This is not going to happen.
They're up 16-7 in the fourth quarter.
But it was quite an atmosphere.
It was
all about Bruschi that night.
Yeah.
The game was important. It was a division game, blah blah blah. But it was all about his return. The crowd was ready. It was one of the more interesting games to be a part of for sure.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The place was electric, and look, from a covering it standpoint, there was a little bit of uncertainty about how Bruschi was going to play and respond, and even whether he should be back on the field.
Yeah.
That was part of the conversation going into that game. That was not the conversation at the end of that game.
I remember pregame we shot warm-ups as if it was a game because you didn't know if he was going to go down at any minute.
Absolutely. But the way that game ended really kind of goes to what we're talking about here.
It's just watching the Bills fall apart in spectacular fashion. Up 16-7 in the fourth quarter. Corey Dillon scores a touchdown for New England to make it a 2-point game. Kelly Holcomb immediately fumbles the ball deep in their own territory. Dillon scores again. So within 90 seconds, the Bills have gone from 16-7 to down 21-16. And that was basically it, as the Patriots win by that same score of 21-16.
It was the last Bills drive that everybody talked about and became another part of, not a huge part, but a mini part of Bills lore. Eric Moulds had called for a push-off pass interference, questionable at best, on a play where he would have had a first down at about the Patriots' 20-yard line or so. And then 2 plays later on 4th and 8, Kelly Holcomb throws to Moulds for 0 yards. So you need 8 or the game's over and you throw for 0. This became another. This was really the first of that theme of why are you going for less than what you need on a 4th down play when the game's in line?
So the Bills go into the bye week at 3-5. Week 10 versus Kansas City. Kelly Holcomb injured in the second quarter, suffers a concussion via Jared Allen. So J.P. Lossman is back in because he has to be back in by default. Throws 2 touchdowns to Lee Evans. The Bills go on and beat the Chiefs. And maybe, okay, at this point, they're out of the bye week. They've had time. Lossman's been on the bench for a few weeks. Was there a feeling that, maybe JP maybe slowly figuring it out as they have this come from behind win against the Chiefs?
No.
Yeah. No. I do not recall having that feeling at that moment.
The biggest thing about that game is there was one touchdown where a security guard who's facing away from the field gets taken out by
Lee Evans.
By Lee Evans, yeah, he's going down, and the guy just goes down. And after that point, I remember the rest of that season, there was more concern about where those guys were, trying to make sure, because there's not a lot of room on the sideline, especially around the corners of the end zone, which is about where that play happened. So for the rest of the year, they wouldn't really move away that far because they had a job to do. But there was concern about making sure that did not happen again. I don't remember if the guy got seriously injured, but it was.
He got carted off.
It was nasty looking enough that was different the way that the team, the security guards were positioned the rest of the year. And even now, there is not someone who stands that close to the field behind the end zone at New Era Field.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of space on the sidelines at New Era Field. So the good feelings or whatever feelings from that game against Kansas City, well, they disappear the following week as the Bills go to San Diego. J.P. Lossman starting in front of 450 friends and family in the crowd. J.P., a native of Southern California. Lossman goes 20 of 36 for 168, sacked 6 times. Meanwhile, on the other side, Drew Brees goes for 28 of 33 for 339 yards and 4 touchdowns. It was 35-10 at halftime. The Chargers win 48-10. And, oh, man, talk about just the gulf between a team at the top of the sport and a team at the bottom. It's illustrated no better than with this game.
It was a clinic by San Diego. It was impressive. It was scary. It was a reminder of where the Bills were and where they were not going to be anytime soon.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that. Again, a defense without Takeo Spikes was powerless against that San Diego offense. You had Tomlinson in the backfield.
Yeah.
You had Breeze, and then you had Gates at tight end. way too much for the
He
Bills.
didn't even finish that game, Gates, I don't think, right?
Well, when you're up 35-10 at halftime,
it didn't matter. Yeah,
no one has
exactly.
to finish that. None of the starters had to finish that one. Week 12, the Bills come back home. They face the Carolina Panthers. They lose that one late. Lossman throws a late pick in that one as well. But week 13, the Bills go to Miami. And
legendary.
We've looked at bad games from the Bills drought, and I think this one has to go in the list of, if not top 5, definitely top 10. Bills start the game perfectly. Could not have gone better. 3 touchdowns, Lossman and Lee Evans in the first quarter alone to put the Bills up 21-0. In the start of the second half, London Fletcher takes out Gus Frerotte, sacks him in the end zone for a safety. Frerotte suffers a concussion. In comes Sage Rosenfels. And if you didn't know the name on the back of the jersey, you would have thought it was Dan Marino.
Yeah. He did whatever he wanted to, mostly in the second half. And what ends up happening is that Rosenfels leads them back, and they win the game 24-23, scoring 21 points in the fourth quarter.
Including the last one in the last, 10 seconds of the game?
6 seconds to go.
6 seconds, yeah. And it was a play where the clock was running. It was the last play of the game. The thing that always got me about that game, that loss, is as bad as it was, giving up 21 points to Sage Rosenfels to lose a game, the Bills' offense did nothing after that first quarter. Again, it was another example of where J.P. Lossman had a flash, and then the other 3 quarters was real JP.
I agree. I mean, to me, first of all, I remember the utter disgust after that game. There was just pure disgust. Not only was it a complete collapse, but against the Dolphins.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, that just hurt.
Still a rivalry then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, that stung at that time. And I think that kind of fed into some of the things that were going to happen, a week or so after this. But I remember the utter disgust after that loss. And then the other thing is, you look back on that, and there was one of those windows where you could see what, when Donahoe kind of put it together in the crystal ball, what he saw. The quarterback with Lossman, the receiver with Evans. We put these 2 incredible athletes on the field and just let them go. And in that moment, they did. And as you said, it was a flash.
And the Bills had quite a succession at receiver that really doesn't get discussed. I mean, from Andre Reed to Eric Moulds to Lee Evans to Stevie Johnson.
And he was worthy of that. Evans.
Yes,
he was
absolutely.
in that category.
And Stevie, of the group, Stevie maybe would have been the weakest link, but he was still a quality receiver for a time. And then you get to Sammy Watkins now. Not only were they alpha receivers and great players and impressive. Like I remember watching Eric Moulds in practice would play one-handed catch, just one-handed all day. Well, Lee Evans saw him do that, played with him a little bit, then he would do it. Not only that, in the locker room, Eric Moulds, stand-up guy, could always go to him for a soundbite, always, spoke to the media. Lee Evans, same thing, most of the time.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I don't know that a player ever had to bite their tongue more than Lee Evans.
Yeah.
How many times did he go to bat for that offense when on the inside he was seething about missed opportunities in his career? There's a guy that really could have been something, really could have put up some monster numbers, I think, and just never got with the right quarterback.
You mentioned Eric Moulds being a stand-up guy. Well, the following week, week 14, after that Dolphins loss, Eric Moulds suspended for conduct detrimental to the team. And you talk about guys biting their tongue in front of the media. They close the door. The media is outside of the locker room, and I can only imagine what some of those battles must have been like, because you have these all-pro talented guys watching a quarterback throw balls at their feet, over their head, and I can only imagine how frustrating it must have been to be that talented and not being able to use your talents because the guy who's supposed to get you the football can't do it.
Eric Moulds was not a step out of line kind of guy. For him to do something that merited a suspension, it had to have been unusually combustible in the locker room. And, the whole J.P. Lossman, quarterback, et cetera, you can understand why it would go there. That was certainly something that was extremely out of character for Eric Moulds, a surprise, when it happened. And really, I look back at it now as something that I can't believe that Eric Moulds got suspended for a game.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. There's a couple of things you think about with Moulds. One, you had to think at that point, he's beginning to see his time is starting to run out. He's still playing at a high level. He had decent stats that season, but you can tell even he had to know he was beginning to get to the end of the line. And he had re-signed with Buffalo, I think, with the promise that they were going to make a push and become an elite team again, where he could have certainly gone to some other places and maybe had a shot at a ring somewhere else, but stayed with Buffalo. And, there had to be a part there where he thought to himself, boy, did I make a mistake.
And we've talked about these, big figures on the Bills roster that have had these falling outs, whether it's with the front office or with the head coach. Reuben Brown, is suspended or not suspended, is a gray area in the final game of the 2003 season after he is caught on camera by News 8 saying, I'm done, I'm out of here. So now you have Eric Moulds 2 years later, and you think, Reuben Brown, Eric Moulds, like, these aren't guys that you kind of think of like, that guy gets in trouble. He's a guy that stirs the pot. And now here they are getting in trouble with the Bills coaching staff in the front office.
It's always good to beat the Dolphins, baby.
Tom Donahoe was well known to be a micromanager. I mean, up and down the organization, not just with head coach, scouting staff, with secretaries, with the person who decided where the pictures went. And it didn't matter. He was on them, and I think it just raised the tension level of the entire organization. That had to filter in the locker room at some point.
Yeah, and I agree. The only thing I would add to that is just, I think to me it's sort of a peek inside that locker room. Malarkey is trying so hard to keep control of this team, and you can see the veterans are just frustrated, you know, and it ccame to a boil right there.
So the Bills lose at home against the New England Patriots 35-7. It's Brady versus Lossman. I mean, the Bills weren't winning that football game. 4-9, I mean, they're officially done. Week 15, they go to Denver on Saturday night. Lossman is out with an injured shoulder, so Holcomb has to come back in. Broncos score 4 straight drives. Also not a contest. Week 16 in Cincinnati, the Bengals are 11-3 going into this game, and this is the one where you look at the schedule for the entire 05 season, and you go like, wait a minute, how did the Bills win this game? The Bills win in a shootout over the Bengals 37-27. And fellas, were either of you there? Well, it was a Christmas Eve, so maybe not.
No.
For a team that's 4-10, but
4-10 Christmas Eve road trip. Nobody went to cover that game.
To Cincinnati. No offense, Cincinnati.
That's just when you're in media and there's, as Mark pointed out, there are already huge sacrifices that are made by family and by yourself in terms of the travel and the schedule. You're not going to say, look, guys, I got to blow off Christmas Eve because I got to go cover a 4-10 team in Cincinnati. You just didn't do it. It didn't make. And from the station point of view, you don't spend money on that trip for coverage on Christmas Eve that nobody's going to watch because everybody's at home singing carols and drinking eggnog.
That's true. You wonder if the Bengals maybe checked out on Christmas Eve as well that night.
Yeah. As it turned out, they didn't need the game. If they had won the game, they still would have been a 3 seed. So it didn't really make a difference in the playoffs.
Terrence McGee does something that had never happened in the history of the National Football League. Terrence McGee has a 99-yard kickoff return for a touchdown and a 46-yard pick six. The first guy in NFL history to have a kickoff return touchdown and an interception return for a touchdown in the same game. Week 17, the Bills go to the New York Jets. Their season is over. I mean, they're 5-10. Going into that game. The Jets win 30-26.
Bills did it right. You got to improve your draft spot. I think they went up 4 spots with that loss.
No one knows draft spots like you.
That was smart offense by the Bills. Smart strategy that week. But it didn't matter. Everybody was ready to move on. And by moving on, it wasn't just to the next season. It was from the current front office structure because changes were coming.
Right. I think in most respects it was just largely over. But from everyone's standpoint, even the fans, they were ready to kind of put this season behind them. What they lose, I think, 6 of 7 down the stretch.
Yeah.
Everybody had enough at that point.
5-11 to wrap up 05. Just your thoughts on a season that didn't really have that had hopes going into it, but were extinguished very quickly.
The quick summation is that this was a team that 4-6 months earlier had all the hope in the world, coming off as close as they've come to a playoff spot, an encouraging run, and then everything turned around. I mean, the quarterback was changed. The new quarterback was terrible. The defensive leader was gone after week 3. There were front office issues. They went from a team on the rise to a team that needed a total explosion and total detonation in the span of 4 to 6 months. And it was just, I think the Bills fans, it was a downer that they hadn't experienced in a long time. Even the first Greg Williams year, 3-13, whatever, first coach, it didn't work out. Mm-hmm. This was, second year of a regime with Mike Malarkey, hope, and then everything went wrong and a total start over was coming.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add to that is this. I think our worst fears were realized when it came to J.P. Lossman. There were concerns that he couldn't do it, he couldn't carry the load, and in the end, I think those concerns were confirmed. And now going into that offseason, we've got a problem at quarterback. We have not solved this issue.
Lossman 1-7 as a starter, and I know win-loss record doesn't say everything about a quarterback's performance, but 1-7 says a lot. And Lossman clearly did not have it in the 2005 season. And as we look at the first 6 years now of this playoff drought, we talked about 2000 doesn't feel like the drought. 05 to me is like the drought has started with this season. You could say it starts with that Week 17 loss in 2004. But at this point, you go, oh no, and you mentioned 2001. Okay, that was a bad year, but this is a bad year with no hope for the future. And just, obviously with hindsight, you can say yeah, that's true. But in 05, did you kind of look to the horizon and think I don't know where this team's going?
There was that thought. I don't think we were talking drought yet though, because I think it was okay. There's going to be a new GM. We're going to flip over some of the front office. Head coach has got some potential. We'll see where this goes.
Yeah, again, I think for me the big thing is that you had a group of aging veterans on this team for which the window was closing. You know, you look at a guy like Lauren Malloy on defense, you look at a guy like Eric Moulds on offense, and you knew, you know, I think one of the things about the drought for the Bills is that one of the things that was always so frustrating covering this team was that they could never put all the pieces together at the same time. They'd get an offense together, and they couldn't play any defense. They'd start playing some great defense, and then they just couldn't move the ball offensively. They just could never put it all together. And I think this is one of those moments where you say, we've got a problem at quarterback, and once again, we've got to go back to the drawing board. And I think from that standpoint, I don't know if drought is the right word, but I think there was a lot of concern about when this was going to turn around.
After the Week 17 loss to the New York Jets, Ralph Wilson says in the locker room that changes will be made. We know the axe is swinging, but whose head's going to be on the block? To that, we go to the next episode of Down and Drought.